The empty bedroom screamed at me. I stood frozen in the doorway, my breath coming in short gasps as my eyes swept across the small space where my 6-year-old son, Ethan, had fallen asleep just hours before. His dinosaur comforter lay bunched at the foot of the bed, and the window that I always locked twice, stood wide open. Cold wind whistled through, making the blue curtains dance like they were celebrating something I couldn't understand. My legs trembled beneath me as I stumbled forward, checking under the bed, in the closet, anywhere a frightened child might hide. But there was nothing. Just silence. Just absence. Just the heavy weight of a mistake I was beginning to understand. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out with shaking hands. One voicemail notification glowed on the screen. The number was saved as Ryan, my ex-husband, Ethan's father, the man I had foolishly begun to trust again. I pressed play, and his voice filled my ears like poison. "You said I'd never be a father again." He laughed, that cruel, familiar laugh that had haunted my nightmares for years. "Let's see you stop me now." The phone fell from my hand. Police sirens wailed in the distance. Everything went black. My name is Clara Rivers, and I thought giving my abusive ex another chance was the right thing to do. I was catastrophically wrong. But before that moment of absolute terror, I was just a woman trying to survive. Years ago, I had escaped Ryan with nothing but Ethan in my arms and clothes in a garbage bag. Those early days were brutal. Sleeping in my car, working 3 jobs, wondering if I'd ever feel safe again. But slowly, carefully, I built something. A small apartment with yellow walls that made me smile. A job at a marketing firm that actually paid enough to breathe. And most importantly, a routine with Ethan where we were safe, where he laughed, where I could tuck him in at night without listening for footsteps in the hallway. I started a candle-making business as a side project, pouring my pain into scented wax and making small batches in my kitchen. "Mama, why do you make sad smells?" Ethan had asked once, holding up a lavender candle. I smiled and told him they weren't sad, they were healing. Slowly, my life became mine again. But there was always a shadow. Ethan would ask questions about his father, and my throat would tighten. "Where's Daddy?" he'd ask, his innocent face breaking my heart into smaller pieces each time. I didn't know how to explain that his father was the kind of person who destroyed things he claimed to love. Everything changed when Ethan turned 5. He started asking harder questions, questions I couldn't dodge anymore. "Does Daddy not love me?" he asked one morning, his small voice destroying me. That's when my mother, Patricia, started calling more frequently. "He deserves a chance," she'd say, her voice firm and disapproving. "Children need their fathers, Clara. You can't keep him away forever." I tried to explain about the violence, about the nights Ryan had thrown things at walls while Ethan cried in the next room. I tried to describe the emotional torture, the way he had made me feel like I was constantly failing, constantly not enough. But my mother would sigh like I was being dramatic. "People change," she'd insist. "You're being spiteful. Think about what Ethan needs." My therapist, Dr. Morrison, had warned me against this. "Clara, your ex showed no genuine remorse," she had said carefully during one session. "Reconciliation requires accountability, and he's never offered that." But the guilt gnawed at me. What if she was wrong? What if I was being unfair? What if my son's happiness was worth the risk? My sister Mia begged me to reconsider, but everyone else, neighbors, teachers, even strangers, seemed to think I should give Ryan another shot. The pressure built like water behind a dam, and I was starting to crack. I'll never forget the day Ryan showed up at my door with flowers. They were expensive flowers, the kind he'd given me years ago when he was trying to make amends for some terrible thing he'd done. I almost closed the door in his face. But then I saw Ethan's face appear behind me, his eyes widening with a hope so pure and desperate that I couldn't bear to deny him. "Daddy," Ethan whispered, and something inside me broke. Ryan knelt down, his eyes wet with what looked like genuine tears. "I'm so sorry, buddy," he said, his voice trembling. "I've missed you so much. I'm different now. Better. I want to be your dad again." Ethan threw himself into Ryan's arms, and I watched my son hold his father like he was the most precious thing in the world. Looking at that moment, I felt torn between protection and guilt. My therapist's voice echoed in my head. "You can try supervised visits. Controlled environment. But go slowly." Against every instinct that screamed danger, I agreed. One supervised visit. We'd meet at the community center, where other families gathered. Ryan would pick Ethan up, and I would watch from a nearby table, ready to intervene if needed. It felt like a compromise, giving my son what he needed while protecting him. I didn't realize I was giving Ryan exactly what he wanted: access. The first visit went smoothly, almost too smoothly. Ryan arrived 10 minutes early, showered and clean, dressed in a button-up shirt that probably cost more than my weekly groceries. He greeted me politely, even respectfully, asking how I'd been. At one point he brought Ethan an action figure, a tiny Batman with a cape that barely hung on. I watched them play together on the floor of the community center, my son laughing in a way I hadn't heard in months. Other parents smiled at the scene of a father and son bonding. No one saw the way my stomach twisted with dread. When the visit ended, Ryan walked us to the door. "Thank you for trusting me again," he said, and for a moment, his hand brushed mine. I pulled away quickly, but he smiled like he'd won something. That night, my phone buzzed with a text message. "You looked beautiful today," it read. From Ryan. My hands went cold. I didn't respond, but the messages kept coming. "Why aren't you answering me?" Then, "You're still playing games, aren't you?" I showed the messages to my sister Mia, and she immediately told me to block him. "This is exactly what he used to do," she said, her voice tight with worry. But blocking him felt mean, especially after I'd agreed to let him see Ethan. I convinced myself it was just him being friendly, trying to rebuild some kind of normal relationship. Maybe he was just lonely. I told myself I was being the bigger person by not overreacting. Over the next 3 months, Ryan became increasingly present in our lives. He'd offer to pick Ethan up from school, and I'd say yes because it was convenient and because Ethan's face lit up at the idea. He'd drop off groceries at my door, things he knew I needed, acting like it was no big deal. One Saturday, he fixed my kitchen faucet that had been dripping for weeks. I stood in the doorway watching him work, and I almost convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, he had changed. Maybe people really could transform. Maybe I had been too hard on him all these years. Ethan adored having his father around. He'd talk about Daddy's house and the games they played there during visits. "Daddy has a bigger TV, Mama," he'd say. "And he lets me stay up late." I felt a pang of jealousy mixed with something darker, a fear I couldn't name. Dr. Morrison's warnings echoed in my mind during our therapy sessions. "How do you feel about the increased contact?" she'd ask. I'd shrug and say it was fine. Everything was under control. But it wasn't under control. Control was slipping through my fingers like sand, and I was choosing to let it go. One evening, Ryan came to pick up Ethan for an extra visit. As he was leaving, he glanced at my left hand and smirked. "Still no ring, huh?" he said, and just like that, the old Ryan flashed through for half a second. Cold. Calculating. Cruel. But then he smiled warmly at Ethan and left, and I was alone with my racing thoughts. The real warning sign came on a Tuesday evening in March. I was putting dinner dishes away when I noticed something odd. A white van parked across the street. As I watched, my stomach dropped. It was Ryan's van. He was just sitting there, engine running, watching my house. I ran outside, my heart pounding. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, approaching his window. He rolled it down slowly, completely calm. "Just making sure you're safe," he said like it was the most normal thing in the world. "You know this area isn't great at night." My hands trembled with rage and fear. "Leave. Now," I said, my voice shaking. He smiled, started the engine, and drove away slowly, deliberately. That night I called the police, but they explained that without a restraining order or a direct violation of custody terms, there wasn't much they could do. I pushed a chair against my bedroom door anyway. I didn't sleep. Instead, I lay in the dark, listening to every sound, realizing that the man I'd been trying to trust had never stopped being the man I'd feared. The predator was just wearing a better disguise now. The next week, Ryan filed for shared custody. His lawyer was smooth and professional, presenting Ryan as a reformed man desperate to be involved in his son's life. In court, Ryan wore an expensive suit and spoke carefully about his desire to co-parent responsibly. I showed up nervous and shaking, my anxiety evident to everyone in the room. The judge looked at me with what I interpreted as skepticism. "Ms. Rivers, the child's father, has shown genuine interest in being present," the judge said. "I'm ordering supervised visits to continue, But I'm also recommending mediation to work toward a custody agreement that benefits the child. As we left the courtroom, Ryan brushed past me and whispered, "I told you I'd win. I always win." My lawyer touched my arm sympathetically, but even she looked uncertain about what came next. I realized then that the legal system wasn't designed to protect women like me. It was designed to give men like Ryan second chances, third chances, infinite chances. The game was rigged, and I was just beginning to understand the rules. Ryan's manipulation campaign went into overdrive after the court appearance. He told mutual friends that I was unstable and vindictive, painting a picture of a bitter ex-wife trying to keep a child from his father out of spite. Slowly, I noticed people treating me differently. A neighbor who used to wave stopped making eye contact. My mother called me one afternoon and mentioned something casually, something Ryan had supposedly told her about my erratic behavior. I felt like I was going crazy. Was I being unreasonable? Was my protective instinct actually just bitterness? The isolation was suffocating. I confided in my therapist, who gently explained what was happening. Gaslighting. "He's making you doubt your own perceptions," Dr. Morrison said. "And he's turning your support system against you. This is a classic abuse tactic, Clara. It doesn't matter if he's changed his behavior on the surface. The underlying pattern is still there." That's when I decided to start documenting everything. I bought a small voice recorder at an electronics store, telling the clerk it was for interviews for my business. I kept it in my purse, activated during pickups and drop-offs. I also started saving every text message, every email, every interaction. My sister Mia helped me organize files on my computer, labeled by date. "We're building a case," she said grimly. I didn't want to admit that's what I was doing. The breaking point came 3 weeks later. Ryan called me in a panic one night, his voice frantic. "Clara, Ethan's sick. He's burning up with fever and throwing up. Please come to the house right now." Without thinking, I grabbed my keys and raced across town to his apartment, my mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. When he opened the door, Ethan was sitting on the couch playing video games. Perfectly fine. No fever. No sickness. No distress whatsoever. Ryan smiled at me like I was the joke. "Just wanted to see you," he said casually. "Wanted to see if you still cared enough to rush over." The humiliation was instant and crushing. I stormed out, shaking with rage and something that felt dangerously close to despair. But that night, as I lay in bed unable to sleep, something shifted inside me. The girl who had escaped Ryan, who had rebuilt her life from nothing, wasn't going to let him destroy her again. I wasn't going to be a victim anymore. I was going to be a strategist. I checked my voice recorder the next morning. The file from that evening was clear. Ryan laughing, admitting he'd lied. I sent the recording to my lawyer immediately. My lawyer, Patricia Chun, listened to the recording and her expression changed. "This is good, Clara," she said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "This is evidence of manipulation and emotional abuse. Do you have more?" I played her 3 more recordings over the next week, conversations where Ryan said things like, "I can make you look unfit in court with one phone call, and your son is going to forget about you anyway. You'll see." Each recording was a nail in a coffin I was carefully constructing. Ms. Chun filed for a temporary restraining order, presenting the evidence to the court. This time I stood straighter. This time I knew who I was protecting, not just Ethan but myself. The judge granted the order. Ryan was furious. During the hearing, he stared at me with pure venom. "You'll regret this," he whispered as he was leaving the courtroom. I didn't respond, but I recorded his threat anyway. For once I had proof of who he really was. For once the system was listening. For exactly 2 weeks I breathed easier. I took Ethan to school, picked him up, and we maintained our routine without Ryan's presence looming over us. I even laughed again. Real laughter. Not the nervous kind I'd perfected over the years. But on the 15th day, something felt wrong. When I came home from work, Ethan's school bag, the red one with dinosaurs on it that he carried everywhere, wasn't sitting on the porch where the after-school program always left it. My stomach dropped. I called the school immediately. "Ms. Rivers," the principal said carefully, "a man came by around 3 o'clock with a note saying you'd authorized an early pickup. He had Ethan's name and information. We followed protocol, but..." I didn't let her finish. "What man?" What did he look like? My voice had gone high and strange. Tall, dark hair, said he was the father. I hung up and immediately called 911. Within hours, my house was filled with police officers. An Amber Alert went out. The news vans arrived by evening. I sat on my couch, numb, replaying every mistake I'd ever made. I had given him the tools to take my son. I had given him access. I had chosen to believe in a lie. The waiting was unbearable. Every hour felt like a year. Police searched Ryan's known addresses, but he'd disappeared. His apartment was empty, his car gone, his phone turned off. I gave detectives everything, his family's contact information, his work history, everywhere I'd ever seen him go. But he'd had months to plan this. I realized with horror that I'd been the one giving him the blueprint for exactly how much access he needed. On the second day, Ryan appeared on a local news station. He was calm, well-groomed, and sympathetic. I just wanted to protect my son from a toxic mother, he said to the camera, his voice steady and convincing. She's been keeping us apart out of spite. I'm just trying to do what's right for Ethan. The comments online were brutal. People called me a liar, a selfish ex-wife, a bad mother. Strangers were voting on my fitness as a parent based on a smooth-talking man and his lies. The humiliation was suffocating. But as I sat there reading through the hatred, something shifted. The pain crystallized into something sharper, clearer. Fury. Pure focus fury. Not the kind that destroys you, the kind that builds you into something stronger. I looked at my sister. He won't get away with this, I said. And I meant it. I remembered something Ryan had mentioned months ago during one of our friendly conversations. He'd talked about a property his cousin owned upstate, a place where he could get away and think. I also remembered that we used to share an email account for bills years ago. I tried the password, the same one he'd used for everything. It still worked. My hand shook as I scrolled through old emails, months and months of correspondence. There it was. A receipt for a motel room, paid with his credit card in a town called Riverside, about 4 hours away. The date was 3 days after he'd taken Ethan. I printed the receipt and called Detective Morrison, who was leading my case. I think I found where he is, I said. The detective was quiet for a moment. Ms. Rivers, I appreciate you trying to help, but we need to follow proper procedure. We can't act on this information without corroboration. Let us handle it. But I wasn't going to wait. Ethan was my son. My responsibility. My failure that I had to fix. That night I called Mia. I need your help, I said. We're going to find him. Mia and I drove through the night, taking turns at the wheel. I had printed a picture of the motel online, memorized its layout, and programmed the GPS. We arrived just after dawn, exhausted and terrified. We parked 2 blocks away and waited. I had my phone ready to call the police the moment we saw them. At 7:30 in the morning, Ryan walked out of room 12, holding Ethan's small hand. My son looked tiny next to him, confused and scared. My heart nearly stopped. I watched as Ryan led him back inside, and I immediately dialed 911. My son has been kidnapped, I told the dispatcher. I have eyes on his location right now. The police arrived within 20 minutes. I watched through tears as they knocked on the motel room door. Ryan tried to run through the back exit, but officers were waiting. Ethan was carried out by a female officer, and when he saw me, he started screaming, "Mama! Mama!" I ran to him, scooping him into my arms, and I finally allowed myself to break completely. We were together. We were safe. We were finally going to be free. The courtroom was packed the next week. Ryan sat at the defense table, his smooth exterior finally cracking. His lawyer tried everything, claiming he was just taking his son on a bonding trip, that he hadn't been properly informed about the restraining order, that the motel receipt was circumstantial. But I had my recordings. I had my documentation. I had a motel manager who confirmed Ryan had paid cash and kept the curtains drawn the entire time. Most importantly, I had Ethan, who sat in the courtroom clutching a stuffed animal, his presence speaking louder than any testimony. The prosecutor played my recordings for the judge. Each one was more damning than the last. Ryan's calculated threats, his manipulation, his complete disregard for his son's well-being. The judge's expression grew darker with each statement. When she ruled, her voice was firm and final. Full custody granted to Ms. Rivers. Permanent restraining order. No contact without written permission from the court. The defendant is remanded in custody pending trial on charges of custodial interference and stalking. As officers led Ryan away, he looked at me with pure hatred. For a moment I saw clearly who he had always been. A man who couldn't stand losing control. But he had already lost. I had taken it back. The next few months were about healing. Ethan started seeing a child psychologist who specialized in trauma. Some nights he'd wake up screaming, searching for me. I'd hold him and whisper that he was safe, that I would never let anyone take him again. I started therapy 3 times a week instead of once. Dr. Morrison helped me process the guilt that consumed me. Guilt for giving Ryan a chance, guilt for not seeing the signs sooner, guilt for putting my son in danger. You made the best decision you could with the information you had, she'd remind me. But you also trusted your instincts and protected him when it mattered most. That's what mothers do. Slowly, very slowly, we began to smile again. Real smiles. Genuine laughter. Ethan and I established new routines: Thursday night movie nights, Sunday morning pancakes, weekend trips to the park. We were learning who we were outside of fear. One evening, about 3 months after the trial, Ethan asked me something that made my chest tight. "Mama, is Daddy bad?" I sat down beside him, choosing my words carefully. "Your daddy made some very bad choices," I said. "But that doesn't mean you're bad. You're so good, Ethan. You're so loved. And I will never, ever let anyone hurt you." He nodded, accepting this truth in the way children do, with simplicity and faith. I hugged him close, grateful that he was still young enough to believe his mother's promises. 3 weeks later, my mother came to visit. She knocked on my door with flowers and a guilty expression that broke my heart all over again. "Clara," she said, her voice trembling, "I need to apologize. I was so wrong about Ryan. So wrong about you." I watched her cry, and instead of anger I felt sadness. She had believed the best in people, the same instinct I had acted on, but it had cost me and my son dearly. "I just wanted to believe that people could change," she said. "I wanted to give him credit for trying to be better. But I should have trusted you. You're my daughter, and I abandoned you when you needed me most." I forgave her, but the trust didn't return immediately. We both understood that what had happened couldn't be erased with an apology, but it could be the beginning of rebuilding. We started having dinner together again, and slowly the relationship found new ground to stand on. It was different now, more honest, less about pretending everything was fine. And somehow that made it stronger. A journalist named Rebecca Chun reached out to me about a month after the trial concluded. She'd seen the court coverage and wanted to tell my story for a magazine about coercive control and custody abuse. I was terrified at first. The idea of putting my life on display felt violating all over again. But then I thought about all the women who'd stayed silent, who'd second-guessed themselves, who'd given abusers second chances because society told them to. I thought about my own mother, who'd believed that forgiveness was always the right answer. I agreed to the interview. Rebecca was respectful and thorough, asking hard questions but listening with genuine compassion. When the article came out 3 weeks later, it went viral. The headline read, "He seemed remorseful. Then he kidnapped our son." My inbox flooded with messages from women sharing their own stories. Some had escaped abusers. Others were still trapped, using my story as a blueprint for how to escape. Teachers, counselors, and therapists reached out asking for permission to share my experience with their clients. I realized then that my pain could have purpose. My nightmare could light a path for others trying to find their way out of darkness. 6 months after the trial, I started a support group in the community center basement. I called it Breaking Free, a circle for survivors. My hands shook as I set up chairs in a circle that first evening. I didn't know if anyone would come, but women arrived, 12 of them on that first night. Some brought children. Others came alone. We sat in that circle and I told my story from the beginning. The abuse, the escape, the mistake of trusting, the recovery. When I finished, there was silence, and then one woman raised her hand. "I'm still living with my ex," she said quietly. "He convinced me that leaving would make me a bad mother, that he'd take my kids away." Another woman nodded. "He told me I was crazy for being scared, that I was overreacting." A third woman spoke. "We are not crazy. We were conditioned to minimize our own pain. That became the mantra of the group. We are not crazy. We were conditioned. Every week more women came. We shared strategies for documentation, names of lawyers who understood coercive control, resources for housing and jobs. We cried together. We laughed together. We reminded each other that survival was not weakness, it was strength. My candle business grew in unexpected ways. After the magazine article, orders started coming in from people who wanted to support me. I was shocked at first. I'd never expected my small hobby to become anything significant. But women wrote notes with their orders. Your candles helped me get through my divorce. I light one every time I need to remember I'm strong. I realized that the act of creating something beautiful from pain was powerful. That's when I decided to launch a special candle line called Reclaim. Each candle was named after something I'd taken back. Reclaim your voice. Reclaim your safety. Reclaim your future. A portion of the profits went directly to my support groups fund, which helped women access lawyers, therapy, and housing. Within a year, the business had expanded so much that I could leave my marketing job and run it full-time. I hired 2 other women from my support group to help with production. We worked in a small studio, filling the air with lavender, eucalyptus, and rose scents. But more importantly, we filled that space with proof that we could create our own futures. We didn't have to wait for men to save us. We could save ourselves. 18 months after taking Ethan from the motel, Ryan's probation was violated. He'd made contact with someone he wasn't supposed to, a witness in the case. And when investigators found out, he was back in custody. I received a letter informing me that he'd been returned to prison. I felt no joy reading those words. Just relief. And closure. Ryan had continued to lose everything. His job had terminated him after his arrest. His family had cut off contact after the truth came out about what he'd done. And his dreams of some fresh start had evaporated completely. He was exactly where he deserved to be, living with the consequences of his own cruelty. I showed Ethan the letter in age-appropriate terms and he asked, "Does Daddy have to stay in timeout forever?" I smiled sadly. "For a very long time, yes." He nodded, satisfied that justice had been served in a way his 6-year-old mind could understand. On a sunny afternoon in April, Ethan asked if we could visit his father in prison. I was surprised. It was his idea, not something I'd ever suggested. Dr. Morrison and I talked about it in therapy. "What matters is that Ethan feels safe," she said. "If he wants to see Ryan with you present and protected by glass, that might actually help with closure." So we went. We sat in the visitation room, Ethan in my lap, Ryan on the other side of the glass. For the first time, I saw my son look at his father without hope or fear. Just curiosity. "Why did you hurt Mommy?" Ethan asked, his small voice cutting through the noise of the prison. Ryan opened his mouth and closed it. He had no answer. He had never had an answer. He had just had manipulation and lies and the ability to make people doubt themselves. But looking at his own son, he couldn't lie his way out of this. "I'm sorry," he said finally. But Ethan had already turned to me and rested his head on my shoulder. In that moment I realized that was the most powerful revenge of all. My son could see the truth. He would grow up knowing that his mother wasn't crazy, wasn't exaggerating, wasn't being unfair. He would grow up knowing that some people hurt others, and that's not acceptable, and that love doesn't excuse cruelty. By Ethan's 7th birthday, our life had transformed. My support group had expanded to 3 meetings a week in different neighborhoods, serving over 200 women. The Reclaim candle line was sold in boutiques across the state. I had been interviewed for podcasts and documentaries about custody abuse and coercive control. I had become something I never thought I'd be. A voice for the voiceless. A light in the darkness for women who were terrified and alone. Ethan was thriving. He was happy, secure, and surrounded by love from me, my sister, my mother, and the community of women who had become our extended family. He didn't have nightmares anymore. He laughed freely. He was becoming the person he was meant to be, not defined by trauma but strengthened by it. One night I stood in his bedroom doorway watching him sleep. His breathing was deep and peaceful. On the nightstand, one of my Reclaim candles burned softly, filling the room with the scent of lavender and safety. I thought about all the choices that had led to this moment. The decision to leave Ryan. The choice to rebuild. the terrible mistake of giving him another chance. And finally the decision to fight back, to document, to speak up, to refuse to be silenced. I lit a new Reclaim candle beside Ethan's bed. The one labeled Reclaim Your Future. I whispered a promise to him, even though he was asleep. No one will ever take you from me again. I will protect you. I will fight for you. And I will teach you that love is never supposed to hurt. The candle glowed softly, and I watched my son sleep, finally truly safe. Outside his window the world continued on. But inside this room in this moment there was only peace. There was only the quiet knowledge that I had survived the unsurvivable. I had transformed my pain into purpose. I had taken back my life, my voice, my dignity. And I had taught my son that sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is refuse to accept what others tell you to accept. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it glows quietly in the darkness. A small steady light that refuses to be extinguished. And that light was mine. That light was us. And nothing would ever dim it again.